Working with brushes in Illustrator can be a little bit tricky when you're just starting. We have 5 different types of brushes, 3 different tools we can use to draw, and some of these features don't feel all that intuitive. So today I'm gonna teach you everything you need to know about working with brushes in Illustrator. How to set them up, what are the differences, what's the best tool to use, and even how to make use of your graphic tablet with them. And in the end, I'm gonna make a full drawing to showcase a little bit of everything we will learn today. So get your stylus ready and let's get down to business. And for this video, I'll be using this beautiful Artist Pro 16 Gen 2, which was sent to me by the sponsor of this video, XPPen. With a 16 inches and 2.5K display, the Artist Pro 16 features the new X3 Pro Smart Chip stylus, which powers this beauty with 20% higher accuracy than the previous model and a whopping 16,000 pressure levels, the first of its kind in the world. The display features a wide color gamut coverage ratio of 99% of the sRGB spectrum and a high color accuracy of delta E. The screen has blue light eye protection and an anti-glare etched glass surface that simulates a realistic pen and paper experience. The Artist Pro 16 also comes with a wireless shortcut remote that offers 10 buttons and a dial, making the workflow on your favorite software so much easier. And that's all not to say how beautiful and comfortable this thing is, with wrist support, built-in foldable legs, and overall a beautiful modern dark gray design. Thank you XPPen for sponsoring this video, and you can check the links in the description to learn more about the Artist Pro 16 Gen 2. Now, let's dive into Illustrator and begin our lesson. And the first step is making sure that our graphic tablet is working in Illustrator, which is thankfully a very simple task. You obviously don't need a pen display, a graphic tablet will work just as well, and as long as you have the appropriate drivers installed, all you need to do is plug it in your computer and Illustrator will take care of any setup needed. Pressure, tilt, and any other features should work straight away. And remember, the right drivers for your tablet can always be downloaded on the manufacturer's website. Second, let's talk briefly about brushes themselves. Brushes in Illustrator work in a very specific way, since Illustrator is a vector software. Different from Photoshop, which works with raster images that allow you to have super realistic brushes, Illustrator is limited to creating brushes with vector artwork, which means there's only so much realism you can have. On the upside, however, brush strokes are just vector paths with a custom stroke applied, which means you can always go back, edit the path, and even change the appearance of the brush itself. So it's really a question of choosing the pros and cons that will best suit your workflow and art style. Illustrator is best suited to make illustrations and things like cartoons, where you have a lot of solid lines and solid colors, while Photoshop is the best option for realism and detail. Now, while this is not a tools tutorial, I will go over the basic drawing tools that we're gonna be using. And to be honest, they're all quite similar to each other, so there's not much to learn. We have the pencil tool, the brush tool, and the blob brush tool. The brush is definitely the most complete and versatile, while the pencil and the blob brush are kind of washed down versions of it. So in the end, if you wish to, you can only use the brush tool and accomplish pretty much everything we'll see here. They all work by clicking and dragging on the artboard, but the end results will be a bit different. For one, each of these tools accept different kinds of brushes. The brush tool can use all 5 brush types we have in Illustrator, so calligraphic brushes, scattered brushes, art brushes, bristle brushes, and pattern brushes. The blob brush, on the other hand, can only use calligraphic brushes, and the pencil cannot use any brushes at all. It just creates a path and applies a regular stroke, so you're limited to the options available on the stroke panel, like rounded caps or dashed lines. The pencil tool also doesn't make use of the tablet's pressure, so lines will always be the same thickness all the way. It doesn't matter how hard you press the pen on the tablet, while the brush and the blob brush do use pen pressure if you tell them to. And to finish the differences off, the brush and the pencil will create a regular path with a stroke and no fill. So you can still change, for example, the thickness of the stroke after you've drawn the path. The blob brush, on the other hand, will expand the stroke, leaving behind a closed path with no stroke and a fill, which makes it harder to edit, but also makes it a good option to fill in big chunks of color. Now, let's take a look at each type of brush. The calligraphic brush is the most basic type of brush in Illustrator. If you want to plug your graphic tablet and immediately get a brush that responds to pressure, that's the one you gotta use. We're gonna click on the plus icon at the bottom of the brushes panel and select the first option. The Calligraphic Brush starts as a simple round brush and has 3 properties we can use to customize it. If we increase the size, the brush gets bigger. If we reduce the roundness, the brush gets squished. And if we change the angle, the brush gets rotated. Pretty simple stuff. I'm gonna hit OK for now and just draw a few brush strokes on the artboard using my pen display. The great thing about brushes in Illustrator is that now we can go back to editing that brush and see the changes in real time affecting the brush strokes on the artboard. For that, I'll double click the brush on the brushes panel to go back to editing it and make sure to check preview at the bottom. Right now, all 3 properties are set to fixed, which means their values won't change and every brush stroke will be exactly the same. If we open the drop-down menu, we can see that we have quite a few options to change this behavior. All 5 options at the bottom use inputs from your graphic tablet. So if for some reason you're working only with a mouse, fixed and random are the only options you can effectively use. Let's see how each one works. Selecting any option other than fixed will unlock the variation control. Let's start with random. Random means every new brush stroke we make will pick a random value for this property, and the range is defined by the variation. So if size is 20 and variation is 10, every brush stroke will be a random size between 10 and 30. And the same is true for the other 2 properties. If we set everything to random, every new brush stroke will have a different size, a different roundness, and be at a different angle. Now let's see the options that make use of features from our graphic tablet. We have 5 of them: pressure, stylus wheel, tilt, bearing, and rotation. But most likely your tablet won't have all these functions. Pressure is definitely the most common one, and basically every graphic tablet and pen display has it. Pressure changes the property based on how hard you press the pen on the tablet. This option is most useful when set to control the size of the brush, so we can make these beautiful brush strokes that naturally get thicker at the center. The variation slider controls how thick and thin the brush will be based on the pressure. Then we have stylus wheel. This is a property exclusive to airbrush pens, which is a special kind of pen that has a wheel in it, called a stylus wheel, and it looks just like a mouse wheel. You can use that wheel to change the property, but I cannot show it to you because I don't have an airbrush pen. Tilt is the angle between the pen and the tablet. As you tilt the pen, the value of the property will increase. This option is most useful when set to control the size of the brush and simulate the way a pencil makes a thicker line as you tilt it on the paper. Rotation, sometimes also called barrel rotation, is the rotation of the pen on your hand. This option is most useful when set to control the angle of the brush to simulate how a flat tip pen gets thicker or thinner depending on how you rotate it. My pen display doesn't support rotation, so I cannot show this one either. And I purposefully left bearing last because it is kind of a mix between tilt and rotation, and it's a bit confusing, I'm not gonna lie. Bearing takes into consideration both the tilt and the direction in which you're tilting. This option is most useful when set to control the angle of the brush. And while it's cool to know how everything works, let's put our feet back in reality and take a look at how the vast majority of you will be using this brush with your tablets. Angle and roundness set to fixed, size set to pressure. For a regular brush, keep roundness at 100%. And if you want something like a flat tip pen, reduce the roundness. If your tablet supports rotation, perhaps set the angle to rotation, but that's already a minority of people that will have this feature. Alright, let's move on. The scatter and art brushes aren't available when we use the new brush button, and that is because these brushes need a vector input to work, which is called the brush artwork. So instead of starting with a circle like the Calligraphic Brush, we start with whatever artwork we want. Let's see the scatter brush first. The scatter brush, as the name implies, scatters the brush artwork along the path drawn. Let's make a simple brush using a start, and to create such a brush, we can simply drag the vector to the brushes panel and select the scatter brush option. First, we'll just click OK to create the brush and draw a path with it. Now we can go back to adjusting the settings and see in real time how the changes we make affect the brush itself. On the brush settings, we have 5 main parameters to change. The size of each star, the spacing between them, the scatter, which is how distant the star will be from the original path, its rotation, and at the bottom, how colors will be applied to the artwork. On the drop-down menus, we have the same options we've seen before, things like random, pressure, or tilt. The scatter brush is a brush that's very easy to use with just a mouse, because more often than not, it's the random way in which the artwork is scattered along the path that makes this brush so useful. I'm not saying you cannot use pressure or tilt, but in my experience, most of the time I've set all parameters to random. To demonstrate that, let's turn this into a brush we can use to paint stars on the night sky, and I'll use random for every parameter. Different from the calligraphic brush, where we had a variation setting when using random, in the scatter brush, the random value will be selected from a specific range we can define. I'll make sure to check preview at the bottom and play with these values on all parameters until I get something that looks nice. For the scatter parameter, it's important to understand that negative values scatter the vector to one side of the path and positive values to the other. So it's better to set the random range from negative to positive to create a more uniform and natural look. At the end, these are my settings, if you want to try it out. But I suggest you experiment yourself, that is always the best way to learn. Now, I'll just draw some random lines going over this night sky and see how it looks. If something is out of place, we can always edit the path to make adjustments. You can also use a scatter brush to add a little bit of detail to what would be a regular brush. If you use a circle as the vector input, set size and spacing to pressure, and add just the tiniest amount of scatter, you have what looks like a regular calligraphic brush, but with a little bit of detail and personality. Just beware, scatter brushes create lots and lots of instances of the brush artwork, which can quickly lower the performance on Illustrator, depending on your computer. We also have a few colorization options, which determine how the stroke color we have selected when drawing will affect the colors present on the brush artwork. On our examples, we only use solid black shapes, but the brush artwork can be anything, any vector, and it can use multiple colors as well. We have 5 colorization options: none, tints, tints and shades, and hue shifts. They are kinda hard to understand, but I'll do my best. None keeps the original color of the brush artwork, and no matter what stroke color you choose, it won't affect the brush. This one is quite simple. Tints paint the brush artwork in tints of the selected color. If we go to the color guide panel, we can see what tints are. They are lighter versions of the color you selected. And more importantly, we can see that there is no black in tints. So the way it works is, anything black will be painted the color you selected, and everything else will be painted in tints of that color. This method tends to make the artwork a little bit lighter in color. It's also worth mentioning that while black gets painted, white remains white. Tints and shades, on the other hand, use the full brightness range of the selected color. So black now remains black, white remains white, and everything in between become tints and shades of the selected color. This method tends to give more contrast and be more faithful to the original brightness of the artwork. Finally, hue shift uses the key color selected on the brush settings. We can use the eyedropper to select a different color to use as key color. The way hue shift works is it applies the selected stroke color to the key color we selected on the settings and shifts the hue of everything else based on the color we applied. It's a bit confusing, I know. All brushes that have colorization options follow these rules, so I won't explain it every time. The scatter brush offers endless possibilities. My goal here is to technically teach you how to maneuver the software, but the amount of things you can create with it is limited only by your creativity. So explore and experiment, you might come up with things you didn't even think were possible. Just like the scatter brush, the art brush also needs a vector input. But differently from the scatter brush, where it takes the brush artwork and repeats it a lot of times, the art brush stretches the vector along the path. And as you can imagine, this has its benefits, but also quite a lot of downsides. To demonstrate the art brush, I'm going to use this brush stroke sample I downloaded from public domain vectors. Again, we'll drag it to the brushes panel, select art brush, hit OK, and then draw a few brush strokes on the artboard. Now, double-click the brush on the panel, and back to editing, checking the preview option to see what we're doing. For the art brush, you won't be able to significantly change the initial vector input, so start with something that already looks like the brush you want. On the brush settings, the most significant changes you can make are the width and the brush scale. On the width, we have the same options as always, so if you want the brush thickness to respond to pressure or tilt, you can select that on the drop-down menu. This works just like scale on the Calligraphic Brush. Now, on the brush scale, we can define how the brush artwork will be stretched along the path of the brush. There are three options: scale proportionately, stretch to fit stroke length, and stretch between guides. Scale proportionately is by far the least useful option, as it will scale the vector both in length and width. It has the benefit of not distorting the original vector, but the huge downside of being almost impossible to maintain a consistent size between strokes, as they need to have the exact same length for that to happen. Stretch to fit stroke length is the default option and the one that's most ready to go. It will simply stretch the brush artwork on its length to match the length of the path. You can control which direction is the right one using the arrows on the right side of the window. Finally, stretch between guides is perhaps the most useful of the three. You can define an area along the length of the vector which will be stretched, and anything outside that area will be maintained. So if I drag the guides to protect the ends of this brush stroke on our example, you can see how the end result changes drastically, because now the ends of the brushes are not being distorted anymore. This allows us to be creative and make, for example, a brush in the shape of an arrow and then use the guides to protect the arrowhead. This is something that can come in handy while making flowcharts or infographics. Down at the bottom right, we have the overlap options, and you almost always will want to leave the option on the right selected, as the option on the left creates these weird gaps on the stroke. Oh, and try to never make the path go over itself, because this brush doesn't handle that very well. And this wraps up the art brush. It's a super simple brush to set up and can give you some pretty awesome results. So definitely try it out for yourself and see what you can come up with. The Bristle brush is quite peculiar because from afar it looks like a very detailed brush, but as you zoom in, you realize that it is just a lot of transparent shapes stacked on top of each other, which is fine, don't get me wrong. I think it's awesome that they managed to pull off such a cool looking brush with just that. But just be careful, if the brush size is too big, this stacked shapes appearance becomes quite noticeable. Just like the Calligraphic Brush, the Bristle Brush doesn't need any vector artwork, so we just need to hit New Brush and select Bristle Brush there. And you already know the drill, we'll just hit OK, draw a simple stroke on the artboard and go back to editing so we can see what we're doing. The Bristle Brush simulates, you guessed it, a Bristle brush. So the very first option is the shape, as we have bristle brushes of all kinds of shapes. But in all honesty, they're not that different from each other in Illustrator, so the other options are much more significant to customizing the brush's look. Shape will offer slightly different densities and stacking of the shapes on the brush. Some are more chaotic and some are more aligned. Then we have a series of sliders to play around. Size controls the actual size of the shapes that make up the brush, so a bigger brush size will create a brush made out of bigger rectangles. Length is similar, but it kinda stretches the shape sideways, so it almost feels like you're pressing a bristle brush stronger on the paper, so the bristles spread to the sides. Density controls how many shapes will be stacked on top of each other to create the fade effect of the brush. A higher density might create a more realistic brush, but it will also be more demanding on your computer, because you're literally adding several objects to the artboard with each stroke. Thickness is kinda odd, because effectively what it does is turn the corners of the shapes round. I believe it simulates how a thin bristle would allow you to have sharper corners than a thick one. Opacity controls the transparency of the shapes, so if you crank it up to 100%, you get a solid black brush, and as you lower it, it becomes more transparent, adding that fade effect. And finally, stiffness controls how flexible or rigid the bristles of the brush would be. So a rigid bristle will create more accurate brush strokes, while a flexible bristle will be more loose and organic. The Bristle Brush doesn't offer a way to control any of the parameters with your pen, but size will automatically respond to pressure. On my years of using Illustrator, I've seen very few people actually using Bristle brushes, which leads me to believe that they're not that popular and useful, but I will leave that up to the artists. Now, let's move on. The last brush type is the pattern brush, and this one is quite interesting. You can use a pattern you have saved on the swatches panel as the brush artwork, and the brush will stretch and distort this pattern so it can follow the path. But that's not all. If you want to work with straight lines, you have the option to set up how the pattern will behave on corners. And that's where things get a little complicated, but super cool. Let's see how we can set up a pattern brush the right way. First, let's click on the new brush button, and this time we won't need to just hit OK and then draw a few lines, because the preview inside this window is pretty good. We do need though to have the pattern tiles already saved on the swatches panel. For this example, I'm using these tiles here, and I'll show you later my method to set these up. The first thing we need to do is to select the tiles. We have 5 different tiles to select, but if your tiles are perfectly centered, tiles 1 and 3 can be the same. I always start by selecting tile 2, which is what makes up most of the path. Now, as we select the corners, we can see that in case you don't have custom tiles for the corners, Illustrator auto-generates a few options. How well they fit depends heavily on the pattern you're using, so sometimes it looks pretty good, sometimes it doesn't. You can toggle the auto-generated tiles off with this checkbox at the top, which is what I'll do since I have my own corner tiles. And as I mentioned before, I'm selecting the same tile for both corners, because I know they're perfectly centered. Then we have the start and the end of the path, which can be confusing by looking at the preview because the start of the path is at the bottom right, so just keep that in mind. Another important setting in the pattern brush is the fit. It controls the behavior of the tiles along the path. Stretch to fit will distort the length of the tiles, so they always fit in the drawn path. It's the safest one, but it has the downside of distorting the tiles, which can look odd at times. Add space to fit simply adds a blank space in between tiles until the path is long enough to accommodate a new tile in between. It's a very specific option, and I believe that it's also the least used. And finally, we have approximate path, which only uses entire tiles with no distortion, and tries to recreate the path as close as possible. It has the benefit of not distorting anything, but you won't always get the exact path you're trying to create. You can see that the pattern abruptly snaps to the sides when there is enough space for a new tile to fit in. And lastly, you have the standard options for changing colors, flipping the artwork, and controlling the scale with your pen. Now, I mentioned I'd show you my setup to create pattern tiles, and here it is. I set up 5 tiles, and the secret is to make sure your pattern always runs exactly through the center of the tiles, so you'll always get the corners to fit. When all tiles are done, I'll remove the outline color of the squares and drag both the pattern and the square to the swatches panel. This forces the tile to be a square and won't look weird on the brush. Okay, this pretty much sums up everything about brushes in Illustrator. Now, let's draw. For this video, I'll be vectorizing this drawing, which is a scene from the animated series Scott Pilgrim Takes Off from Netflix. It's the kissing scene between Scott and Ramona.
Sparks.
I'm a huge fan of this. I've watched the movie and read the comics multiple times, and the animated series was just so good, so I decided to recreate the scene. I'm not an artist, I'm not good at drawing, I can only do rough sketches for design projects, so I'll try to give you an honest beginner's experience on drawing in Illustrator. And for starters, having to deal with pressure from the pen and getting the line thickness right was kinda hard for me, so I decided to work with the pencil tool, which only uses regular strokes and not brushes. Thinking back now, perhaps that was not the greatest choice for this video, as I spent the last 15 minutes talking about brushes, but hey, I'm a beginner at this as well, and this was the way that worked for me. So for the lines, I basically used 3 tools. The pencil tool to draw the lines, the join tool to join separate lines, and the shape builder for when one line crossed over the other. I found that it was way easier to just draw every line longer than it should be and then just clean them with these tools, rather than trying to get the lines right in a single stroke. Once I finished the lines, I painted the areas that should be black and created a new layer to add the colors. The colors layer was actually just the outlines layer duplicated, as I would be using the outlines to paint the colors. Adding the colors in this workflow was really easy. I just selected the entire artwork and used the Live Paint Bucket tool. Basically, what this tool does is it identifies closed areas and allows you to paint any color inside it, even if the area is made of separate paths. It has the benefit of being super fast and easy to add color, but it has the downside of forcing you to have all lines perfectly placed. Because if you have a line that's even a single pixel away from touching the other line, the Live Paint Bucket won't identify that area correctly. I had previously saved all colors I would use in the swatches panel, which were actually just copied from the original frame of the animation, and once I had everything painted, it was time to add the finishing touches. On the outlines layer, I removed some of the lines that were not needed anymore, like the highlights of the hair and the shading of the neck. Then I duplicated once again the outlines layer, placed the duplicate below all layers, and added a very thick outline that would appear just on the outside of the drawing. Finally, I used a width profile to make the lines just a little bit more interesting, since I didn't draw them with a pressure-sensitive brush. Then it was just a matter of cleaning up the drawing, removing lines where it was needed, playing with the stroke width, and adjusting some paths that were looking weird. And this is the final result. I quite enjoyed making this, and even though it's not an original work, I'm quite proud of it. Drawing is a hard skill to master. It takes lots of little steps to do it, and this was my first one. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you once again to XPPen for sponsoring this video and sending me this awesome pen display. Remember to check the links in the description to learn more about their products. If you enjoyed this video, check this other one here. A special thanks to all my Patreon supporters who help me make high quality content like this one. More on how you can support the channel in the description down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any doubts. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye!